When most people hear the words cemetery and graveyard, they picture the exact same thing. A quiet field of headstones. Wind in the trees. Maybe a crow or two if your imagination runs a little dramatic. In everyday conversation, we swap the words without thinking. But what if I told you that, buried under those two simple terms, there's a whole story about language, religion, city planning, and even public health? In this video, we're digging into the real difference between a cemetery and a graveyard, how these words were born, why they split apart, and what they reveal about how humans learn to live with their dead. Let's start with the words themselves, because language is often the first clue that something deeper is going on. Graveyard is the more straightforward of the two. It comes from Old English, grave or graf meaning grave, and geared meaning yard, enclosure, or fenced place. Put together, it literally means the yard of graves, an enclosed area where bodies are buried, typically right next to a church building. It's practical, earthy, and descriptive. No poetry, just location and function. Cemetery, on the other hand, arrives with a bit more mystery. It traces back to the Greek word koimeterion, meaning a sleeping place, or dormitory. Early Christians used this word not just as a euphemism, but as a theological statement. Death, to them, was sleep in anticipation of resurrection, rest now, wake later. That Greek term moved into Latin as coimeterium, then through Old French, and finally into English as cemetery. Even in the word itself, there's a softer, more spiritual tone. One term sounds like a yard behind a building. The other sounds like a promise that this isn't the end. These two words really pull apart in meaning during medieval Europe. For centuries, if you were a Christian living in a village or small town, your final resting place was almost always the churchyard. This is what we properly call a graveyard. The church was the center of community life, where you worshipped, married, confessed, celebrated, and gathered. Being buried on its consecrated ground symbolized staying within the protection of the church even in death. The graves clustered around the building, sometimes wrapping all the way around it, were a constant reminder to the living. The communion of saints included both those inside the walls and those under the soil. But there was a problem. Populations grew. Cities expanded. People started living longer, but more of them were dying in the same small spaces. Churchyards, especially in crowded towns, began to fill up. Graves were reused. Bones were moved into charnel houses. In many places, the ground itself rose higher as generations of burials layered over one another. By the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in rapidly growing European cities like London and Paris, churchyard graveyards simply couldn't keep up with the number of burials. Alongside the problem of space came another concern: public health. Overcrowded graveyards were blamed, sometimes fairly, sometimes not, for foul smells, contaminated water, and disease. Whether every fear was scientifically accurate or not, the perception was clear: packing more and more bodies into small churchyards right in the middle of town felt unsafe. Laws were proposed. Reforms were pushed. In many places, burials within city centers were restricted or banned. The solution that began to emerge was a new kind of burial ground, set apart from the church and often outside the busiest areas of town: the cemetery. Cemeteries were different from graveyards in more than just location. While graveyards were typically compact spaces squeezed around existing churches, cemeteries could be planned from the ground up. Land was set aside specifically for burial, often outside crowded city cores. Designers could think about layout, pathways, drainage, and aesthetics. This gave rise to the famous garden cemetery movement in the 19th century. These weren't just fields of graves, they were landscape parks with trees, ponds, winding lanes, and grand monuments. Places like Père-Lachaise in Paris or Highgate Cemetery in London became early examples of cemeteries as public spaces, part burial ground, part open-air museum. In these garden cemeteries, people did more than mourn. Families would stroll on Sundays, couples walked the paths, and artists sketched the sculptures. Before modern city parks became common, cemeteries were often some of the only green spaces available to the public. The dead essentially donated peaceful landscapes to the living. So while graveyards spoke of tight-knit religious communities clustered around a church, cemeteries reflected a broader, more civic vision. The city as a whole needed quiet, reflective, and hygienic places for its dead, and its living. So if we boil it down, the simplest historical difference is this: graveyards are attached to churches, cemeteries are separate. But as with most simple things, the details make it interesting. Graveyards are usually limited by the footprint of the church's land. They tend to be smaller, more irregular, often with graves crammed in at odd angles. It's common to see very old stones, some leaning, cracked, or half swallowed by the earth, with inscriptions faded by centuries of weather. The atmosphere can feel intimate, local, and deeply historical. Cemeteries, by contrast, are usually larger and more organized. They may be laid out in grids or sweeping curves, with numbered sections and maps. There might be areas dedicated to specific religious groups, cultural communities, or veterans, reflecting the diversity of the town or city around them. Cemeteries are also more likely to include above-ground structures like mausoleums, family vaults, chapels, and imposing memorials. While a small village graveyard might contain modest headstones and simple crosses, a big urban cemetery can look like a stone city of angels, obelisks, sculptures, and granite avenues. Even the emotional tone of the words in modern English hints at these differences. When you hear graveyard, what pops into your mind? Many people think of ghost stories, haunted houses, or horror movies. The phrase graveyard shift feels eerie and lonely. Graveyards have been the classic setting for tales of restless spirits and midnight wanderings. They feel older, rougher, and more gothic in the pop culture imagination. Cemetery, on the other hand, sounds more formal and neutral. You're more likely to hear it in official contexts: cemetery records, cemetery office, cemetery regulations. It tends to evoke a sense of solemn respect rather than spooky atmosphere. This doesn't mean cemeteries can't be eerie, of course, but the word itself doesn't carry the same Halloween baggage. Writers, filmmakers, and even tour guides choose one term or the other depending on the mood they want to create. A graveyard feels like a place where something might jump out at you. A cemetery feels like a place where you might bring flowers and stand quietly. Religion also shapes the distinction. Historically, graveyards were part of church property and were consecrated according to the rites of a particular denomination. That meant, in many places, burial there was tied to membership in that church or at least to that faith tradition. If you belonged to a different religion, or no religion at all, you might not be buried in the churchyard. Cemeteries, however, could be more flexible. Some were still religious, Catholic cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries, and so on, but many were municipal or privately run, open to people from a range of backgrounds. In large cities, one cemetery might contain sections for different faiths, creating a map of the community's diversity in stone. Over time, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, this more inclusive model became increasingly common. Civic authorities and private companies established cemeteries that served entire towns, not just one congregation. Burial became not only a religious matter, but also a logistical and legal one: who owns the land, how graves are recorded, how maintenance is funded. If a graveyard told you about one church and its flock, a cemetery told you about a whole city and its systems. Now, here's where things get a little messy. In modern everyday English, most people don't follow these historical rules. Someone might point at a big, landscaped burial park with no church in sight and casually call it a graveyard. Others might refer to the small, ancient churchyard in their village as the old cemetery. In conversation, the words have blurred together to the point where correcting someone can feel nitpicky. But in specific fields, like historical research, archaeology, urban planning, and the funeral industry, the distinction still matters. For example, if historians are studying burial practices in a medieval town, knowing whether a site is a graveyard or a later cemetery tells them immediately about the religious context, the likely time period, and which kinds of records to look for. A graveyard might be tied to parish registers and church documents. A municipal cemetery might leave a paper trail in city archives, company ledgers, and legal deeds. Preservationists and archaeologists use this distinction when they decide how to protect, restore, or interpret these spaces for the public. The difference also reflects changing attitudes toward death itself. In the graveyard era, death was woven tightly into everyday religious life. The dead rested right beside the place where people prayed each week. You could not attend church without walking past the graves of those who had come before you. In some places, bones were stored inside the building in ossuaries, a stark reminder that life is short and eternity is long. The message was clear: you live, worship, and die within the same spiritual community. Cemeteries, especially garden cemeteries, signaled a new way of thinking. Death was still solemn, but it was also managed, regulated, and, in a way, beautified. The dead were moved slightly out of sight, still honored, but placed in carefully planned landscapes rather than crowded yards. The experience became less about being in the literal shadow of a church and more about contemplation, memory, and sometimes even leisure. The cemetery was both a practical solution to overcrowding and a cultural statement. The city cared about how it looked, how it functioned, and how it remembered. Today, both graveyards and cemeteries serve as open history books. You can walk through a churchyard and see surnames that repeat down generations, family plots that tell you who married whom, and dates that hint at epidemics, wars, or waves of migration. In large cemeteries, you might find the graves of famous artists, soldiers, politicians, and everyday workers all sharing the same hillside. The styles of headstones, the languages on them, and the symbols carved into them reveal trends in art, religion, and identity over time. So next time you pass a burial ground, don't just see it as a spooky backdrop or a quiet place for flowers. Take a moment to ask, what kind of place is this? Is it nestled up against a church, with paths that weave between centuries-old stones leaning in the grass? That's a graveyard, a relic of a time when life, faith, and death all circled around one sacred building. Or is it a broad, park-like space with a grand gate, long avenues, and sections laid out like neighborhoods? That's a cemetery, born from the needs of growing cities and the desire to create peaceful, shared spaces for both the dead and the living. The words cemetery and graveyard might seem interchangeable at first glance, but knowing the difference opens a small window into how our ancestors handled some of life's biggest questions. Where do we put our dead? How close should they be to our everyday lives? Who gets to rest where? Behind those simple choices are stories of language, religion, culture, and community, stories etched in stone, waiting quietly for anyone who cares to read them. Thank you for watching. If you have ideas for other, simple things, with surprisingly complex histories, whether it's everyday objects, places, or phrases, drop your suggestions in the comments below. We might feature your idea in a future episode and give you a shout out for the inspiration. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the hidden history of ordinary words. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more stories woven through the smallest details.